Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to speak. I've heard you've had a great day in the conference, and I'm hoping to finish it well. I'm going to talk a little bit about my research using cognitive networks to study complexity. And I'm going to first thank all of my mentors, postdoc mentors, collaborators, and funding agencies for a series of studies I will talk about in the next 80 or so minutes. I want to start with something that I think is very obvious, definitely probably after your day today in the conference, which is that thinking is complex. And the question is, how can we study this complexity as psychologists, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, educators across the board? In the last 2 decades or so, there's been all these different approaches, especially in neuroimaging and different computational modeling. There's been a lot of different things that are developing. And one approach that I'm using and we'll talk about today is the application of network science to study cognitive and psychological constructs. About 2 decades ago, this multidisciplinary field of network science was somewhat established in the late 1990s, mostly in the late 1990s, and since then has been exploding across all fields of science to the point that some people call it a network revolution, right? And is been using based on a mathematical graph theory, statistics, physics, and also social psychology to study complex systems and represent them, quantitatively represent the networks, and then using different network measures to study the properties of these complex systems. And one such very complex system that a lot of people care about is the brain. The brain is a extremely complex system with billions and billions of neurons connected to each other in a complex fashion. And the application of network science tools to study the brain have completely revolutionized how we study the structure and the function and dynamics of the brain, to the point that now there is a subfield in neuroscience that is called network neuroscience. And there's amazing research that is going on there. I personally am a cognitive scientist, and I study the mental level of human cognition. And surprisingly, when I started doing research, it was really surprising to find out that even though there's all these tools, computational tools to study, and even though a lot of classic cognitive theory was developed in the middle part of the previous century, used as network terminology, still the application of network science method to quantitatively study cognitive constructs is very much limited. As an example, this is a figure from a classic theory on the representation of memory or language or semantic memory that was proposed in 1975 by Collins and Loftus, where they argue that semantic memory is organized as a network structure. And I will talk a lot about this figure in a few slides. So a lot of my research and other people such as Massimo Stella, we talked earlier today, and Cynthia soon, we'll talk tomorrow, and other great researchers, we have been promoting the application of what we call cognitive network science, which is the application of network science methods to study cognitive constructs and domains and psychological constructs and domains, such as memory, language, personality, and many other types of domain in principle. There you can use this across different domains. And what is this approach allowing us to is the ability to study the structure of these domains or systems, the dynamics that operate on these systems, and the interaction across different components of these systems. And I will talk about all of that with examples from creativity very soon. So in my general research, there are 2 aims that I pursue. The first is using network science or cognitive networks to study high-level cognition more than anything, specifically focusing on creativity, memory, and knowledge, which I just realized it doesn't appear here, but other types of constructs that I've been studying, language, intelligence, personality, social norms, and also atypical memory structures in clinical populations. The second part of my research is using the insights that are uncovered from this sort of work and using empirical methods from behavioral studies all the way up to neuroimaging and non-invasive brain stimulation techniques to study these findings. I'm not going to talk about this part at all today. I'm happy to answer questions about that at the end. And also I'm going to be focusing on creativity, but if anyone is interested to ask me questions about other domains, I'm happy to do so at the end. So the talk today will be divided into 3 parts. First, I'll talk a little bit the methods that I used, then I will talk a lot about several of my studies in creativity, and then I will conclude. Right. So I want to go back to the classic theory that was proposed in the 1970s on memory as semantic memory, which is the system or cognitive system that stores concepts and facts void of context or time. So in principle, we can look at this as knowledge or conceptual knowledge. And Collins and Loftus had 2 main arguments in their classic paper. The first is that memory is structured as a network. And nodes or concepts in these networks connect to each other based on the overlap of their semantic features. So the more semantic features that are shared by concepts, the closer they will be and the more connected they will be in such a theoretical semantic network or space. This creates these clusters or neighborhoods or modules of subcategories such as colors, vehicles, etc. However, what these semantic features are and how we can measure them and operationalize them, they kept open. The second important argument that they made in this paper is the notion of a mechanism, a Sperner activation mechanism, that argues that once the concept is activated, say the color red, I'm thinking about the color red, then this concept is activated and cognitive activation spreads from the concept to all of its directly connected nodes and so forth. And this activation decays very quickly over time and space. So here they made an argument for a semantic structure of the system, a network structure, and how that constrains the processes that operate over that structure. Jumping 40 years to the future, I've been using empirical methods based on psycholinguistic tasks such as free association, semantic fluency, and other types of tasks to empirically estimate semantic networks at the group and at the individual level, and then ask quantitative questions on the properties of these networks. And mostly test theories based on the notion that semantic memory is structured and can be operationalized as a network. So how do we do that? To estimate semantic any network, I'm sure you've talked about this, all you need is 2 things. The recipe is actually quite easy. You need to identify the nodes or the parts in the system that you want to examine their organization, which is usually the easier part. And the much more complicated part is the second component, is identifying how to represent the relations between the concepts, how to create or estimate the edges between concepts. Right, so remember that Collins and Loftus talked about sharing of overlap of shared semantic features. And so how can we do that with empirical methods? So there are various ways to do that, and I'm not going to talk a lot about all of them. I'm mostly going to focus on what I have been using, but again, bear in mind that there are other ways to do this. The easier approach is to do this at the group level, to estimate group-based semantic networks. And to do that, you can do that using collecting free association data, which I will talk about soon, or semantic fluency, where you ask participants to generate all the animals they can think of, and then use that to represent the animal base, the category space of the animal category at the group level. If you do this for different groups, you can then compare them and ask interesting questions. And I'll talk about that in the second part of the topic. At the individual level, this is something that is less mature and is more developing. But there are also now methods to do that at the individual base to estimate individual-based semantic networks. And I've been using a relatedness adjustment test, which I will talk about soon. But in principle, some have argued that you can use semantic fluency to estimate an individual semantic network. And I'm not going to talk about that today. So I'll just briefly describe these two methods. So first, using free associations to estimate group-based semantic networks. This approach is based, again, is inspired by Collins and Loftus' claim of overlap of semantic features. And this is how we do it. We have participants, a sample of participants being presented with words or keywords one at a time. So they see the word radio, then they see newspaper, then they see the word tune. And they have 1 minute for each of these concepts to generate whatever comes to mind in that minute. Right? So in 1 minute, generate all the associations you can think of. And they do this for each one of these words separately. And they can do this for as many words as we want. And these words will then be the nodes in the network. So to create large enough networks, we need a lot of words. And then that could take a lot of time. This data, this slide is based on data that was collected by my PhD supervisor, Dr. David Anaki, who collected in the late 1990s data for 800 keywords. So that's 800 minutes. And that's an example of how this sort of task can be very time demanding. And that's one of its limitations. Once we've collected from enough participants free associations to each of the keywords, then we can just simply look at how much of the free associations that were generated across the group to the word radio overlap with the responses that were generated to the word newspaper. Using Pearson's correlation, we can then compute what I call association correlations and create a correlation matrix between all pairs of nodes. Right? So if you look at potentially overlap between these two words in this data set, we see quite a lot of overlap. That's not surprising. News, information, car, morning, etc. And we use this to compute the correlation based on the free association data across these two words. Then we can do the same thing for looking at any possible overlap of responses between radio and tune, and also not surprisingly, there's quite a lot of overlap. And we compute the correlation, and we can we continue on doing all possible pairs. When we look at any potential possible overlap of responses for the word tune and newspaper, we don't find any such overlap. And in fact, semantic networks are very sparse, which is a good thing. We want to have structure and order in our memory system to facilitate efficient communication. I'll talk about that when we talk about creativity, the sort of balance between structure and flexibility, okay, which is one of the themes of my research. Once we compute all possible correlations across all possible pairs of words, we identified the relation between the concepts, and that allows us to move forward to estimate and measure the net. So this is at the group level. Going to the individual level, we can do something that is very similar. We're going to have participants. This is based on work that I've done with the collaborator from Austria. So the words are in German, Kuh and Katze. So it's actually cow and cat. And all participants have to do is move on a slider and judge how much these words are related to each other, between 0, not related at all, to completely related. Okay. Now, participants do this for all possible pairs of words in a set of words. So in this study, they had 28 words. So they judged all possible pairs of 28 words, which is about 200 and something sort of decisions. And then we use their relatedness judgments that move from 0 to 100 to create a symmetrical relatedness judgment matrix. And we use that as a proxy of that individual semantic memory organization. And we argue that that is possible based on a separate study of mine where we showed how we can move from a network structure all the way to relatedness judgments. So once we have that, again, we can compute a lot of network measures at the individual level or the group level, and then ask how these measures map onto or relate to differences, behavioral differences at the group or individual level in any measure that we are interested in. Once we have that, we can analyze the networks, and we have a lot of different tools and methods and measures that we can use across different levels of the network. I mostly am interested in the global properties of the network, how the structure, the overall structure of the network is. And I'll talk about that when I go into talking about creativity. But overall, the three main measures that I study, that I measure in the networks that I analyze are the following. The first is a measure of connectivity, the cluster coefficient, which measures how much the neighbors of my neighbors are connected to each other. So it looks at the specific node, and that's what it measures. It looks at the direct nodes that are connected to it, the neighbors, and it measures how much these neighbors are also connected to each other. So the higher this measure is, the more overall connected the network is, right? And here's a toy example of 10 nodes, where in this example, each node is connected to only one other node, and there is no cluster coefficient. And in this extreme example, all of the nodes are connected to each other, and it's the maximal clustering coefficient. The second measure is a measure of distances or path, and where we can ask how many steps do I need to get from one node A to another node B. Now there's a lot of different paths that one can take, but what is usually measured is the shortest path between a pair of nodes. And if you average over that, then you compute the average shortest path length, which measures how much the network are condensed or spread apart. Again, looking at an example, this I just realized it's different, never mind. This has a lower ASPL than this example. And finally, we can look at the notion of modularity, or how much the system breaks apart into subcomponents or clusters or modules, or in language, we can think about these as categories. Okay, and as an example, again, in this example, here there is no modularity at all, and here the system can be broken apart into these three sub-communities, and there will be some sort of modularity. So we can use these tools to ask questions about the cognitive system, about notions of structure, connectivity, flexibility, rigidity. I'll be talking about all of these notions in the next couple of slides. Here is an example of a pipeline that I use to analyze in the studies that I do based on free association data. So the first part is collecting free association data based on this continuous free association task I talked about before. Then doing some pre-processing of the data, computing the association correlations as I talked about. Then applying a filter to minimize spurious correlations. Filtering networks is a very big open topic, and I can talk about that at the end if anyone's interested. But I use a specific type of filter, which is called a planar or triangulated maximal filtered graph, and it imposes a geometrical constraint on the structure to identify the most important edges and retains those edges in the network. Once we have a filtered network, we're going to analyze the networks, as unweighted, undirected networks. So they're undirected, that means A to B is B to A, because these are based on correlations, which are symmetrical. Then for simplicity's sake, I binarize the weights. So I change all weights to 1, and that creates unweighted networks, and we can talk about that at the end as well if anyone's interested. And then the last part is how to statistically analyze the networks. And that's also a big and open discussion, because for empirical research, network science is somewhat limited in how it can test the validity of its findings. And I specifically use bootstrapping approaches to study the validity of my findings. And I can talk about that too at the end if anyone's interested. Okay, perfect. So that was a very brief, somewhat hand-waving part on the methods. And now we can jump into, I think what's more interesting is in talking about the content that I'm very much interested in, which is creativity. So creativity is a fun topic to study because I think a lot of people are fascinated with the notion of creativity. We all want to be creative. We want to have creative ideas. We want to have creative inventions. It's something that we really aspire to as a society, as individuals. But there's a big question, there's a big problem, which is what is creativity? And that is a problem today that we still really haven't figured out as a community. I just finished a 2-day conference held by the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity, and there's a lot of things that are going on in creativity research. But there are two big problems in the research, in the scientific research of creativity. And the first is depicted in this picture. Creativity is actually a lot of very different things. And it ranges from play to art, from insight to problem solving. And all of these different things actually map onto different cognitive processes. So in fact, when you put on the same roof, in the days that we can all meet, unfortunately, we can't do that right now, but if you bring creativity researchers together, they will talk about creativity in a very differently, and that creates a lot of the problems. And in fact, the research of creativity has been really held back, and only from about the beginning of the 2000s has there been a very big push in creativity research. The second problem that is leading to the stagnation of the research in creativity is the problems of antiquated and problematic tools that we use in the lab when we study creativity. In fact, most of the methods that are used to study creativity were developed, again, about 100 years ago, and there has been a strong development of methods to study the notion of creativity, mostly driven by the fact that creativity remains as an ambiguous construct till this day. What has happened about 2 decades ago, in the beginning of the 2000s, there was a big push into a creative neuroscience perspective on creativity that has fragmented the topic of creativity into specific components. I'm sidestepping these two problems by focusing on my interest in individual differences in the cognitive processes that relate to creative thinking, and specifically the role of knowledge in that plays a part in creative thinking. And the other part of my research is, again, using network science to quantitatively study creative thinking. And I'll tell you about that right now. So to do that, I just want to give you a sense of an example of the method, the most widely used task that we use in the lab till this day to study creativity. It's called an alternative uses task, and it measures divergent thinking, the ability to diverge across different ideas. And the task is very simple. When the participants are presented with a concept like this, which is in this case a box, it could be anything, but it's usually a box or a brick or a newspaper, and participants are asked to say all the possible alternative uses that you can do with this object. All the alternative, all the novel, or the original, there's different variants to this, but they all tap into the idea that people are asked to generate multiple different types of ideas. So when I usually give this talk, I invite people to suggest ideas, and I'm happy to try this too. Does someone want to say what you can do with a box? Doesn't work. Okay, so we'll pass this, but I hope you're all thinking about this. When we ask participants to do that, the most common response in the beginning, like the first response participants say, is you can put things in it, which is a great response. It makes a lot of sense, right? This is what you do with a box. It's a very prototypical response. But is it creative? Probably not. It's not really creative, and most people agree that it's not a creative response. Maybe if you put specific, different, unique things in it, maybe. When we ask participants to generate more responses in this task, then they may say you can hide in it, and then in a later response, they may say you can use it as a costume. And in fact, a common finding that has been shown across multiple different studies using this task in a continuous fashion over time, what it has been found that as participants are generating more and more responses, the responses become more and more creative, or are judged as more and more original over time, also called as a serial order effect. And potentially what's happening is that people are moving away from prototypicality. They're moving away from the most common use to the more creative use. And the theory that I've been studying for many years now is that this task, or creative thinking more generally, involves semantic search processes that operate over one's memory structure or semantic memory and are constrained by it. And the question is how we can measure this theory, which is what I've been doing and I'll show you with a few studies. This theory is strongly motivated by, inspired by, a theory that was proposed in the 1960s that's called the associative theory of creativity by Sarnoff Mednick. And Mednick proposed that that creativity is the process of connecting concepts that are far away or weakly connected in memory structure. And what he speculated was that, what he theorized is that the farther away these concepts are in memory, the more novel or creative the new connection, the new idea will be. And it has to also make sense. So it's not just about novelty. And I can talk more about that component of sense making at the end, if anyone's interested. But specifically, Mednick proposed this idea of connecting weakly disconnected concepts in memory because he, like I am too, was interested in individual differences in creative thinking. And what he argued is that what differentiates between low and high creative individuals is differences in how their memory is structured. What he called steep versus flat associative hierarchies, and I'll just refer to this as semantic memory or knowledge. And what he suggested is depicated in this figure from his paper, where he argued that if you had low and high creative individuals generate free associations to the word table, where the x-axis is different responses over time and the y-axis is a proportion of how many people in that sample generating these responses, then low creative individuals, he argued, would all of them say the word chair as their first response, and then to a much lower extent, other responses, and that will decay very quickly. So for this sort of breaking me pattern called steep hierarchies. High creative individuals, he argued, would also generate the word chair as their first response, but to a lower proportion, and then they would generate more idiosyncratic responses in lower proportions. So they have a sort of flatter, as you see here, sort of memory structure. So I was interested when I started my PhD to study this theory using network science. So the different research questions I have been asking ever since can be broken apart into two types of research. Most of my work is at the cognitive or behavioral level, and I'm interested in asking questions about the role of knowledge in creative thinking. And then more recently, last few years, is to ask questions about the dynamics, the processes that operate over this system and how they facilitate creative thinking. In parallel to that, I have also started working at the neural level using neuroimaging techniques and methods. And you can ask the same questions at the neural level, i.e., how is the creative brain wired differently at the brain level? And what are the neural dynamics that operate over, that relate to generating creative thought? And I can talk about that also if anyone's interested. But I'm going to talk about this part of my research. So we have a theory, the associative theory of creativity, and we have the tools, the networks, estimating semantic networks based on free association data, as I said. And now we need groups of creative thinking that differentiates in creative thinking to test Mednick's theory of associative theory and creativity. So to do that, in my grad school, I collected from a large sample of participants, and about 150 students came to the lab and did a battery of creative thinking tasks, which were 4 different types of things. The first were a battery of the divergent thinking tasks, as I said, as we showed you in the beginning. Then there were a remote association task, convergent thinking task, where participants see 3 words and have to find a 4th word that relates to each of those words separately. Because my PhD supervisor studies metaphors, so a metaphor task, and also a task that measures intelligence, the Raven's matrices, because to control for intelligence across the 2 groups, because the relation between creativity and intelligence is complicated. And I can talk about that too, if anyone's interested. After everyone completed this battery of tasks, using a multidimensional decision tree approach, divided the sample into two sub-samples of groups of low creative individuals and high creative individuals, which were matched across all demographic information, except this compiled creativity score that was based on these batteries. So now we have theory, we have groups, we have the tools, and then inviting back these two groups of participants, the low creative and the high creative individuals, and had them do the continuous free association task that we saw before for 96 keywords. These 96 keywords were the 4 top exemplars out of a range of 24 categories, so colors, vehicles, animals, etc. And all these words were common and concrete words. And specifically, this was important because we used this exact same task to study people with high functioning autism that have problem with processing abstract concepts, and I will talk about that at the end. So I'm going to talk right now, I'm going to now present a few studies, and almost all of them are based on this data. But I've replicated this across other studies with other data sets as well. Cool. So now we're going to have we had the groups do this task, and we're then using their responses to estimate and compare the semantic networks, and this is how they look like. Ta-da! So what we find in that study, so each one of the circles is one of those 96 words, and I remind you that the edges are binary and symmetrical, so all they refer to is that the two words are connected to each other. What we find is that the semantic network of the low creative group was more spread out, it had a significantly higher ASPL, and it was more modular. It had more of these subcomponents than a significantly higher modularity. Also, it's harder to see, but it had a significantly lower clustering coefficient than the semantic network of the high creative individuals. So if we think about the high creative individuals, they have a more condensed semantic network structure that is more connected and less modular. Our interpretation from that study is that this memory structure that is more connected and more condensed potentially facilitates, if you think about the spreading activation mechanism, facilitates spreading of information across the network that allows it to reach farther into the network, potentially facilitating this idea that was proposed by the associative theory of creativity. So in that sense, we provide empirical evidence, quantitative evidence for the associative theory of creativity. But you can say to me, and a lot of people have said that this is not a really interesting comparison. Why? Because I've constantly said the words individual differences in creativity. And potentially when we are aggregating it across participants, then we are throwing the baby with the bathwater, and we're losing the interesting factor of the individual differences. So to do that across different studies, using the individual-based semantic network approach that I showed you before, based on relatedness judgment tasks, did the same thing, testing how the 3 measures at the individual level relate to individual differences in creative thinking, specifically based on their performance, participants' performance in the alternative uses task. So the first study, again, with an Austrian collaborator, what we find is a replication of our group-based effect. We find a significant correlation between clustering coefficient at the individual level and performance in the alternative uses task, significantly negative correlation between the ASPL and creativity, and a trending negative correlation with modularity. This study was replicated with a French collaboration that I'm involved in, and more recently in a third study with a Chinese group that's just been accepted in the journal Thinking and Reasoning. So overall, from this line of work, looking at just the structural properties of the networks at the group level and individual level, what we want to argue is that a more flexible, a less structured, more connected memory structure facilitates creative thinking. So that's about the structure. And now the question is, can we move forward and look at the process of the operate overs? Because remember that the associative theory of creativity talks about the process of connecting weakly or far away connected concepts. So to do that, we went back to the 2 group-based semantic networks of the low creative and the high creative. And we are now going to simulate a search process, a simple search process over the semantic memory structure of both groups. There are different applications of search processes over systems that can be done. What we're using here is called a random walk. And a random walk is a very simple search process. What it does is it jumps from one node to the other based on the probability transition. And it looks something like this, okay? So we're going to use this simple random random walk approach to test search processes in the across the two groups, across the semantic of the two groups. And we're going to do this in the following way. We're going to set the same launch starting point, starting from the same word across both networks, and we're going to let the random walk. Because this was an exploratory study, we manipulated the number, we varied the number of steps the walk can walk from 10 steps to 200. And then we measure two different measures as in relation to the sort of creative aspect of the random walk. The first is how many unique nodes the random walk visited. Because this is a random transition across nodes, it can go back and forth across the two nodes. Again, also in relation to Collins and Loftus' idea of a spread activation model. So we just want to measure the unique nodes that are visited by the walk as a measure of the breadth of the search. And the second measure that we measure in this study is some sort of a distance or strength measure from the initial node to the final visited node. Again, in relation to the associative theory of creativity, the idea is that measuring how weak or farther apart the final node is from the original node. Okay. So how do we do this? This is very briefly the process. We compute the transition matrices. It's easier when the weights are binarized, but you can do this also for weighted networks. Then we're going to choose a starting point, and we're going to let the walk, and we're going to vary the number of steps. And for each number of steps, from 10 to 200 steps, we are going to reiterate this 10,000 times, and then compute the average of these two measures, the breadth and the strength. And we're going to subtract these measures of the high group from the low group, and we're going to measure and we're going to look what we find. Right. So these are the results. This is the results of the breadth of the search. How many uniquely visited nodes the walks, and what we see is that regardless the number of steps, the x-axis, the comparison score, the subtraction from the high minus the low, is that regardless of the number of steps, the random walk over the high creative semantic network reaches more unique or visits more unique nodes than the random walk over the low creative semantic network. Looking at the other measure that we're measuring here about the strength of the connection between the initial and final node, we see that regardless the number of steps of the walks, the random walk over the high creative semantic network reaches weaker final connected nodes. And in that sense, this simulation study also corroborates the associative theory of creativity in the sense that search processes over the high creative individual semantic network reaches farther and weaker nodes. Right. So that is the second part of the story that I'm telling you today. Now I want to move to a third part, which is also related to this. And if you remember, when we talked about the structure, I used the word flexible, and the idea is that more connected, potentially flexible memory structure facilitates creative thinking. And in fact, flexibility is a very important notion in creative thinking. But similar to many other constructs, it's very hard and it's to measure, and it's a very ill-defined construct. What is flexibility? In cognitive psychology, and I was in a postdoc in the lab where many different people studied this notion of conceptual flexibility and all talked about it in very different senses. So how can we measure this notion of flexibility to really study how it relates to creativity? All of the research that is usually done with the notion of flexibility is measured through indirect behavioral switching costs, like the Wisconsin card sorting task, etc. But what we wanted to do in this third study was to ask, can we propose a quantitative measure of flexibility? So to do that, we're gonna, again, go back to use the group-based networks of the low and high curve individuals. And we're now going to use another theory that has been developed in physics that's called percolation theory. And percolation theory asks what happens if you have a system that you know that you can map on its structure, and then what would happen if you start trying to break it apart? If you want to start trying to remove nodes or edges, how will that affect the system? This is based again on theory from physics that argues that the more, if you have a material, say a plastic, the more energy you need to exert to try and break it, the more resilient or resistant or flexible that material is. So we want to use this notion to ask questions about the flexibility of the semantic network structure as measured by its resilience to this attacking process, okay? And ask how this resilience relates to the low and high creative semantic networks. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to represent these networks a little bit differently this time, because what we want is to now use the strength of the edges or the weights. If you remember, initially I said that we're binarizing them, so now what we're computing this a little bit differently and have edge strength for each of the edges in the networks. And then what we're going to do is we're going to remove one edge at a time according to an increasing threshold of the strength of the edges. And we're going to measure the effect of the removal of these edges on the giant component, the largest connected component in the network. Because these are fully connected networks, the size of the giant component starts at 96 nodes and then will go down as we try and break it apart. Okay? So just as an example of what we find. So this is how now the networks look like. They look, again, different, but the same principles still remain. And this is the low creative network, and this is the high creative network. And this is at a stopping point where we're removing edges of strength, of an arbitrary strength up to 0.16. And what we see at this point already is that for the low creative semantic network, there's these edges, there's these groups of nodes that start falling apart. They start breaking apart from the giant component. However, for the high creative semantic network, this does not happen yet. In fact, we need to go further ahead to up to a point of 0.23 strength till these exact same nodes break apart from the high creative semantic network. And this is what we find. This is a summary of our results. The x-axis is the strength of the edges, and the y-axis is, again, the size of the giant component. What we found was that both networks break apart very similarly. The same types of nodes fall or break together across the two groups. But the magnitude of the effect is different in the sense that the high creative semantic network breaks apart much slower, which you see here, than that of the low creative semantic network. In that sense, what we are arguing from this study is that the high creative semantic network is more resilient, it's more flexible. But we weren't satisfied and wanted to continue on and to better understand the mechanism that is facilitating this higher resistance or higher flexibility. So what we did is after we completed the attacking process, removing all edges that we could till both networks were at the same minimal size of the giant component, we went back and did some, in a sense, a reverse engineering where we classify each of these edges as either a within component, because if you recall, these nodes break apart in groups. So as an edge as whether it is a within a component or between components. And then we compare the strength of these between and within edges across the two groups. And this is what we found. What we actually found is that what differentiates between the two groups is that the high creative semantic network has between component edges that are stronger. And in that sense, this is a potential mechanism explaining this higher resilience in the sense that the semantic network of higher creative individuals has edges that glue components more strongly together, and also that facilitates more spreading of activation across or diffusion of information across the networks. So this higher strongly between component edges are potentially the mechanism that facilitates this higher resilience. We argue that this measure, quantitative measure of flexibility, can be used more generally to study flexibility of thought and also deterioration over time, say in dementia. And finally, yes, and I just said that. And finally, another study that I was involved in, now this is not a semantic network study, but it's very relevant and related. What was done in this study was to ask questions about the breadth of the search, or what William James called the train of thought. We're using here tools from computational linguistics to measure the distance between pairs of ideas in a chain-free associated task. So participants in this task are presented with the word toaster, and then they're asked to generate a word that relates to toaster, say bread, and then they see they need to generate a response to the word bread, etc., etc. Okay, and the x-axis is the number of responses that they are generating. The y-axis again is this computational measure of the semantic distance between the concepts. And this measure that we propose in this study that we call forward flow is the average over all the distances across all possible pairs of responses. What we found in this project across 7 different sub-studies was that this measure of forward flow correlated with participants' performance in divergent thinking tasks. Right? And this is an example of a creative person with a high creative individual with a low creative individual, where the high creative individual generates more farther away concepts, if you can see this. And I wonder if this reminds you of, again, Mennick's original idea of sort of flatter versus weaker, steeper memory structures. So this is a wide speculation, but to me it always resonates very well. But overall, the idea from this study is, if you recall, when I talked to you about the random walk study, that was a simulation. This is an empirically data collecting a study where we also show that higher creative individuals can search broader in their memory and generate more farther away or more weakly connected concepts as they are doing this continuous chain-free association task. So just to summarize, again, 4 studies and how network science allows us to ask questions about high-level cognitive constructs, memory, creativity, thinking, search processes, and all of these tools offer us very powerful methods and measures to really move forward in how we can empirically study these theories. Just as one slide of the neural work, we can do the exact same things at the neural level. This is an example from a project where we had people doing the alternative uses task while they're being scanned, MRI scanner, and then using a method that's called connectome predictive modeling, estimate what we call a creative connectome, which you see here, that predicts at the neural level how functional brain connectivity predicts performance in the alternative uses task. So this is, allows us to start asking about the wiring or the functional connectivity of the brain, and other studies that I've been involved in allow us to also look at the neural dynamics that take place in creative thinking. Right. So I'm going to conclude more generally, and I want to first go back to one of the earlier slides, talking about cognitive network science and how it is an extremely powerful approach to study cognitive and psychological constructs, and especially high-level thinking, but across the board, to allow us to look at the structure, dynamics, and interaction across in these systems or domains. And I've talked about creativity today, but as I said, you can use this to study different domains. A lot of the work that has been done so far, like you've heard earlier today and tomorrow, is on language, but other people have been using these tools and approaches to study issues in intelligence, personality, thinking more generally, social norms, aesthetics, and also work in clinical learning and clinical populations. So a few examples of that. one example is a project, is a group that I've been involved in that proposed a way to study the changing in the memory structure over time, or what we call the aging lexicon, right? So the question is, what happens in typical aging? And because while a lot of cognitive capacities decline over age, knowledge continues to being accumulated. So the question is, what is going on at the mental structures, the lexicon, or our semantic memory? We propose different ways on how to do that, but overall, we have the tools to study the representation or the memory semantic networks across time, across cross-sectional groups in different ages, or longitudinal research, and then ask what's going on and how these memory structures are changing over time. And so far, there's been 2 or 3 papers on that, and I've been involved in one such project as well, where we ask how the semantic structure that relates to the notion of a beauty and wellness changes over age. Another interest of mine is to use these tools to ask questions about atypical memory structures in clinical populations. And this is an example that I said I'll talk about at the beginning. Work we've done with people with high functioning autism, where we had the same 96 keyword free association tasks, same semantic network estimation approach to estimate the semantic networks of people with high functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome versus controlled. And what we found was that the semantic network of the people with autism was much more modular. It broke apart into significantly much more modular in these sub-communities than the control network. We interpreted this, what we call hypermodularity, in relation to a behavioral feature of people with autism, which is called rigidity of thought. People with autism are considered, even though there is debates on this, to have difficulties in processing creative language, metaphors, abstract notions, social constructs, etc. And what we argue is that this hypermodularity potentially leads to diffusion of information, to maybe getting stuck in these modules. If you recall, if the activation process is random and decays very quickly over time, then information can get stuck in such modules and not spread across the network. I've done also work with other clinical populations to allow us to look at, again, deterioration and change, and other people are doing this as well. And all of this is allowing us to also propose new theories on how we think about memory structure and its relation to differences across groups and individuals. This is one paper that we published with, a few years ago, where we proposed a cognitive spectrum of different types of memory structure, of semantic memory structure, ranging from very rigid, organized memory structures, such as we just saw with people with high functioning autism, all the way to extremely chaotic, random, completely connected memory structures that there is some anecdotal evidence from studies that I've done that relate this to people with schizophrenia. In between, we have high creative individuals that are more into this sort of chaotic, flexible, random spectrum, and less creative individuals that are more into this direction. And in this specific paper, what we propose is that typical thinking is related to this balance between structure and flexibility. And the more we deviate to one of the extremes, the more we are in danger into becoming more in the more clinical state. Okay? And other projects of mine in this show has shown that analytical thinking or higher intelligence also leads to more structured processes. So for example, having a very structured memory, semantic memory is beneficial when you need to efficiently and analytically retrieve information, but it constrains your ability to create novel connections. A more recent theory that I'm now pushing towards has been proposed by a postdoc mentor, Sharon Thompson-Schill, on how semantic memory is dynamic, and I'm now starting to use these tools to ask questions about change in the dynamics of semantic memory through network analysis over time. So just this is a good segue into saying sort of future research that I think is where this whole field is heading to, and specifically where I am heading to. And the first is into individual-based and dynamic semantic networks, or cognitive networks in more general, and there's more and more research that slowly coming out in this direction. One thing that I strongly believe in, and I'm trying to also implement, is using the language of networks to cut across different levels of analysis. So a lot of my work now is moving to cognitive neural research or cognitive social studies. So for example, we with a collaborator who studies attachment theory with social psychologists, we're looking at semantic networks and social networks of individuals and track how that relates to anxiety levels. At the neural level, we can ask how semantic networks and neural networks track differences in creativity. And we have a lot of power and strength in using these quantitative measures across different levels of domains. Something that I'm strongly interested in and believe that has extreme significance and importance is using this in clinical world for diagnostics and interventions and measurements. And finally, relating to the talk you heard earlier today by Massimo, multidimensional cognitive structures, networks, multiplexes, etc. And Massimo and I have a paper on one study in creativity and multiplex lexicon, but there's definitely so much more work that needs to be done. So just to conclude, I hope, well, I don't think I needed to convince you, but overall, to argue that the application of network science to study higher level cognition specific creativity really allows us to push forward understanding the role of knowledge and memory at the structural level, at the search processes, flexibility of thought, and other things that I didn't talk about, such as the relation between intelligence and creativity, and how network science, and I haven't talked about that, but I'm happy to do more, how combining network science with empirical measures and methods, neuroimaging and behavioral methods really allow us to push forward our studying of complex multidimensional constructs that I mentioned. And thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I understand, the situation is that Ole Alba is having some problems with internet connection, and I was asked to sort of preside over the discussion of this talk. And thank you very much. It was indeed very, very illuminating. I learned a lot from what you have been saying.
Thanks.
Are there any questions from the audience? If you have a question, please don't hesitate, because if you don't, I have... there is a question from Paulina, who is asking what is the difference between clustering and modularity. Can you explain briefly?
So there's, that's a great question because it has different meanings. So I think it's a lot about terminology. Mm-hmm. But there's also specific quantitative meanings here. But so clustering coefficient refers to the connectivity, and clusters that we use in other methods like multidimensional scaling, for example, really refers to what we think about modules. The word in network science, people use the words modules, cliques, clusters interchangeably to talk about the same thing, which is how the system breaks apart into subcomponents. Now, it's important to note that modules, or modules, if we just keep it that, have two properties. One is that the subcomponents are autonomous in the sense that when you break this apart from the system, they remain connected. That component remains connected. But also, it's that it relates to the connectivity or the clustering coefficient. So modularity actually measures two different things. One is how much the system breaks apart into subcomponents and how much these subcomponents are actually connected within themselves. And that means that these measures of clustering coefficient and modules are somewhat related to each other. There is some connection, but the larger the networks, the more independent the measures are. So I've thrown in some more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, if I may comment, add just a few words. I completely agree with what you just said, but well, maybe it will be a good idea to emphasize that modularity is a global property. It is, you have a network as a whole, and you are interested in what is the best way of breaking it up into several big communities. And clustering, it's about what is the probability of your friends being friends between each other? What is the probability of the immediate neighbors of the network having a connection with each other? So it's
completely agree. Completely agree.
Local and global end of to some extent the same thing.
Yeah, that's right. And just to say one last thing is that people that don't know about this, cognitive psychologists use the word clustering when they think about communities.
Yeah.
So again, there's a lot of terminology that is also important to.
Yes. Basically, the point is that, well, for historical reasons in network science, this is the way the words are used. Yes, because in common usage you will call cluster what is called modules, what you will naturally call clusters. Any more questions?
Yes.
Ilya is asking, is it right to understand that, and it is actually related to a question I wanted to ask, because unfortunately I was not from the very beginning of your talk, and I missed this part, how exactly you construct your network. And he is asking, is it right to understand that your association network is undirected, and how you get to an undirected network?
So it's true that the networks are undirected because I use correlations to compute, I use free association data to compute correlations. So the edges are computed by the overall similarity of responses that are generated across keywords. So the more features or responses that are generated with the word table and chair, the more they will be correlated, and that will be the weight, the strength of the weight. And
so basically your network is you ask your subjects to give you associations to table and to chair, and then you compare the answers and you look at the correlations.
So we did this. Yeah, this is a group-based approach. So we have a large sample of participants generating free associations in a continuous fashion. So 1 minute per word. And then at the group level, we look at the sort of the bag of responses or the cloud of associative responses and how much they overlap across different cues. And the larger the network, the more words that are cue words that are used, the larger the network will be. I've used other types of approaches based on semantic fluency, but in very similar. They're all based on computing correlations across responses to estimate group-based and then or individual-based semantic networks. I've also done similar things to analyze psychometric questionnaires, but it's all based on correlation-based approaches to estimate the edges across the nodes. So the networks are always undirected in that.
And then you basically say that you have some level of correlation, and if the correlations are larger than this level, then you have a connection. If there is not, if it is smaller, then you have no connection.
Right. So I'm using an objective filtering approach. It's called information filtering approaches based on imposing geometrical constraints to identify the surviving edges. So I'm not using specific thresholds that to me are subjectively, a lot of times arbitrarily assigned, but using this approach to try and again to identify the skeleton of the network that is the most consistent. And there's different approaches to do that, and it's been used a lot to study financial networks in economy by Tommaso Este and Roberto Matenia from the UK. Yeah. So I'm filtering out, I'm minimizing spurious correlations using this filtering approach, and then I'm binarizing the edges just for simplicity's sake to analyze the networks. And it is true that it's not directed networks anymore, but you can compute directed networks. But the question, and that is where we want to go, because it's very clear that memory is directed in the sense that A leads to B and is not always symmetrical in the relation. And there's a lot more work that needs to be done. There's very few people that are doing this line of research, and we need to have the community grow and to have more methodological analysis. I said also in the beginning that the methods to statistically examine the results of this empirical network research is also very limited. And there's a lot more work. People constantly ask me, what is the reliability of the networks, how stable they are, what is the size of the network that you need? There's all these questions that it's a lot based on heuristics and experience, but we really need to, what is the best way to estimate the networks? Joe Osterweil, who was my postdoc mentor at Brown, they just came out with a paper comparing different methods to estimate networks based on semantic fluency. So it is developing, but there's so much more methodological work that needs to be done. And that's something that has to be pushed forward for us to really establish the validity of this method to study, to be used to study cognition.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I see. Thank you. Any more questions? Can you see can you see the question? As far as I understood, asks Natasha, a flexible network is a network that is resilient to the destruction of some nodes. And right. What sort of process you have in mind when you think of this destruction? Is it some sort of pathology or whatever?
Right. Okay, that's a great question. So a couple of things. First, what we do is we remove the edges and not the nodes, even though you can attack the nodes and see the effect. So what we did in that study is removing edges and seeing the effect that has on the resilience of the network. Now, what is the cognitive, in a sense, the behavioral or the cognitive process that is happening here? So for example, in a project that we just submitted as a paper, we're using a similar percolation approach on semantic networks to ask questions about aging. The question is, what happens with aging? Do the semantic memory structure of older people, are they less flexible? That is what we predicted, and that is actually what we find. So overall, the idea is that, and this is relating to, again, in aging, to the other studies that has shown that as people acquire more knowledge, their memory structures become more mature, more structured. It becomes more differentiated. There are more modules, and also somewhat less connectivity. This process makes the network more fragile, less flexible. And this relates to and other issues of, say, learning.
So you're essentially now saying that, sorry for interrupting you. Am I right that you are actually saying that the more you know, the less creative you are?
So this is a complicated argument, because it's partially true. The more you learn about something, the more you know about it, and then you become more fixated in that, and it's harder for you to become more novel. But without knowledge, you can't make connections. So this is really the fit where we want this balance between learning, accumulating knowledge, but also having flexible capacities. And this flexibility is about structure, but it's also about additional processes. So I should have said this. Creativity is not only about knowledge. There's a lot of different things that are happening here. So we have a lot of top-down processes, attention and memory capacities and personality traits. They all allow us to, for example, in another paper that we published 2 years ago, we examined we compared the semantic networks of people that are high or low on the personality trait of openness to experience. And openness to experience is a very interesting personality trait that has been very strongly linked to creativity. And the idea is that people that are more open to experiences, they have potentially lower filtering thresholds, so they process more information in. And we show that people that are high on this personality trait have a more flexible semantic memory structure, because they learn more things that creates these connections, and that facilitates creativity. But then there's a point where this potentially could have also costs. So some projects that I've been involved in the last year or so try to start better understanding not just the benefits, which is what I've been talking here about, but also the costs of overly flexible, overly rich semantic neighborhoods. So I think there's a lot of things that are going on that we still don't understand. But in principle, yes, we want to learn. The more we learn, the more we accumulate knowledge, the more we protect ourselves by having a more flexible system that can endure pathologies that could destroy edges or destroy nodes. Again, this is all theoretical, but we know that with Alzheimer or semantic dementia, the concepts start to break apart, and we can measure that, what happens when this happens. This whole percolation approach was inspired by a paper that was published in 2011 that really tried to simulate Alzheimer processing on semantic memory, and they show that effect. They link the severity of Alzheimer to the breaking apart of semantic networks. So there's all connected to each other. And I think these are really great, exciting questions that now we have the tools to measure, to study, to design studies, instead of just saying flexibility in a very ambiguous, sort of ill-defined way.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Well, I think I asked mine. And one more thing. This I'm sure you told this, but I probably missed it. There were creative network averaged over creative individuals and less creative individuals. How they were selected? What was the procedure?
Yeah. So we had a large sample of participants come into the lab, and they did a battery of creativity tasks, and then using a multidimensional regression decision tree approach to classify them into low creative versus high creative, where the two groups were matched on all these demographics, but were significantly different on this compiled creativity score. And measuring creativity is a very complicated issue on its own. People have dissertations and careers just on how we can measure creativity. And what I said at that part was that the tools that we have are very limited and are very old in the sense that they're very subjective. So a lot of my work is about, and others, is about moving towards more objective quantitative measures in operationalizing creative thought, because moving towards cognitive neuroscience research of creativity has forced this research to be better in how we operationalize these constructs, and that's actually a good thing. There's cost to this process as well, but for my reasons, that's good.
Okay, thank you.
So I hope I've convinced everybody that creativity is super exciting and networks is exciting.
Yeah, I hope so.
If anyone is interested, please email me on any other questions. I'm just setting up my own lab. I'm also always happy to discuss new collaborations. I'm looking for people to come work with me. So whatever, I'm really excited. I was so happy to receive this invitation, and if anyone is interested, please reach out to me.
Okay, thank you very much. It was really nice. Olga, what are our plans for the rest of the evening?
So it's the end of the first part. Let's we can say goodbye. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.